the black blood of the earth. How dead oceans became the fuel of empires. It did not begin with gasoline pumps or plastic bottles. It did not begin with supertankers cutting through the ocean or jet engines screaming across the sky. It began with death. A slow, silent, incomprehensible death. For hundreds of millions of years in warm, shallow seas that no longer exist, trillions upon trillions of microscopic organisms lived brief lives, died, and drifted down into the lightless depths of the seafloor. There was no oxygen there, no decay, just accumulation. Layer upon layer, millennia stacked upon millennia. They were buried beneath sediment that became rock, crushed under the weight of continents, cooked by the planet's furnace heart at temperatures that would melt lead. What follows is not merely a story about a commodity. It is the story of how humanity learned to drill for ghosts, how we discovered the compressed essence of a vanished world and used it to build our own. It is a chronicle of eternal fires worshipped as gods, of secret weapons that burned on water, of bamboo drills piercing the earth 2,000 years before the West attempted the feat. And it culminates with a single gusher in Texas that roared so violently it announced the birth of a new century. This is the history of oil, from ancient oceans to industrial empires. The truth of where it comes from is stranger and darker than most imagine. The ancient kitchen. Where does oil actually come from? For the longest time, science was not entirely certain. A debate still whispers in the corners of geology, quiet but persistent, refusing to die despite overwhelming evidence on one side. The story taught in schools is called the biogenic theory. It represents the scientific consensus, the bedrock of petroleum geology that has guided prospectors to every major oil field ever discovered. The narrative goes like this. 400 million years ago, during geological periods called the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, the oceans were thick with microscopic life. Plankton, algae, bacteria. They bloomed and died in endless cycles, their populations exploding and collapsing with the seasons. When they perished, they snowed down onto the ocean floor in a constant drizzle of organic matter. In places where oxygen was absent, in the dark anoxic zones of ancient sea bottoms, they did not rot. They simply piled up year after year, century after century, building layers of organic rich sediment. Over millions of years, these layers were buried under newer sediments. The weight pressed down. The temperature rose. Eventually, at depths of 2 to 4 kilometers, the organic matter entered what geologists call the oil window, a narrow band of temperature and pressure where transformation occurs. Think of it as geological cooking, but on a timescale that dwarfs human comprehension. Too shallow, and the organic material transforms into a waxy substance called kerogen, useless as fuel. Too deep, and the intense heat breaks everything down into natural gas, simpler molecules that have been cracked apart by thermal stress. Deeper still, even the gas is destroyed, leaving nothing but sterile carbon. But in that perfect zone, between 60 and 120 degrees Celsius, roughly 2 to 4 kilometers down, the organic matter undergoes catagenesis. The complex molecules of ancient life, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, break down into simpler, energy-rich chains of hydrocarbons. Liquid petroleum. The evidence for this theory is not circumstantial. It is molecular and irrefutable. Inside crude oil, chemists discover substances called biomarkers, chemical fossils that could only have come from living organisms. Porphyrins, which are the degraded remnants of chlorophyll, the molecule that makes plants green and captures sunlight for photosynthesis. Sterones, which are the molecular skeletons of steroids that once formed cell membranes in ancient algae. These molecules are as distinctive as fingerprints. They prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that oil carries the signature of life. Most of the world's oil formed during specific periods of Earth's history when conditions were perfect. The Jurassic period, 150 million years ago, when shallow tropical seas covered much of what is now the Middle East. The Cretaceous period, 100 million years ago, when sea levels were higher than today and vast inland seas split continents. And the Carboniferous period, 300 million years ago, when swamps covered much of the northern hemisphere and produced the coal that would later power the Industrial Revolution. But there exists another theory, darker and more controversial, that refuses to die despite being rejected by mainstream geology. Born in the Soviet Union during the 1950s, championed by a geologist named Nikolai Kudryavtsev, and later promoted with evangelical fervour by the astrophysicist Thomas Gold, this is the abiogenic theory. It proposes that oil is not biological at all. It is primordial, a chemical legacy of Earth's formation. Gold believed that vast quantities of methane, the simplest hydrocarbon, one carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms, were trapped inside the Earth when the planet coalesced from the solar nebula 4.5 billion years ago. This methane, he argued, seeps constantly upward from the mantle through deep fractures in the planetary crust, pathways opened by tectonic forces. As it rises through zones of different temperature and pressure, the simple methane molecules polymerize, linking together to form the longer, more complex hydrocarbon chains that comprise petroleum. Gold even had an explanation for those troublesome biomarkers that seem to prove biological origin. Perhaps he suggested a deep hot biosphere exists, a hidden realm of extremophile microbes living miles down in the crust, in fractures and pores we have barely explored. These microbes, he theorized, consume the primordial methane rising from below and produce the biological molecules that mislead surface geologists into thinking oil is a fossil fuel. It is a seductive idea, particularly to those who want to believe in unlimited resources. It implies oil might be nearly limitless, constantly regenerating, a renewable resource generated by the planet itself rather than a finite legacy of ancient death. During the oil crises of the 1970s, when prices quadrupled and Western economies teetered on the brink of collapse, the abiogenic theory gained popularity as a kind of wishful geology. If oil was abiogenic, the reasoning went, then the wells would refill. The crisis was artificial. Scarcity was a lie told by oil companies to drive up prices. Conspiracy theories still circulate claiming that major oil companies and governments suppress abiogenic research to maintain artificial scarcity and justify high prices. The evidence cited is always circumstantial. A well that produced more than expected, a field that seemed to refill after being abandoned, anomalous concentrations of helium-3, an isotope rare on Earth's surface but abundant in the mantle, found in some oil deposits. The scientific community largely rejects the abiogenic theory, and for good reason. The isotopic signatures found in most crude oil, the ratios of carbon 12 to carbon 13, the presence of specific sulfur isotopes, do not match a mantle source. They match the isotopic signatures of organic matter processed by photosynthetic organisms. The biomarkers are not contamination, they are integral to the oil itself, found in concentrations too high to be explained by microbial activity in deep rock. Yet the theory refuses to die completely. Persistent rumours suggest that Soviet geologists, using a biogenic theory to guide their exploration, successfully drilled for oil in crystalline basement rocks in the Dnieper-Donetsk basin of Ukraine, in geological formations where conventional wisdom said oil could not exist because there were no sedimentary source rocks. Western scientists argue the oil migrated there from sedimentary formations elsewhere, moving through fractures in the basement rock. But the whisper endures, kept alive by a handful of geologists who insist the mainstream has become too dogmatic, too certain. The truth is that both theories may contain fragments of reality. While the overwhelming majority of commercial oil deposits are clearly biogenic, formed from ancient organic matter, there is some evidence that abiogenic hydrocarbons exist in trace amounts deep in the earth. Methane has been found in volcanic gases. Hydrocarbons exist in meteorites that have never encountered life. But commercial quantities, the deposits we drill for, the reservoirs that power civilization, those are graveyards. They are the compressed residue of death on an incomprehensible scale, the petroleum system. Even accepting that dead plankton creates oil, not every accumulation of organic matter becomes an oil field. Success requires a precise sequence of geological events, a system so exact that its occurrence feels miraculous. Geologists call it the petroleum system, and understanding it is the difference between striking it rich and drilling a dry hole that bankrupts you. It demands 4 essential components, and the absence of even one means no oil will accumulate. First, the source rock. This cannot be ordinary stone. It must be rich in organic carbon, typically 1 to 10% by weight, which is extraordinarily high for rock. The best source rocks are dark shales, fine-grained sedimentary rocks that were deposited in quiet, oxygen-poor environments where organic matter accumulated faster than it could decay. Examples include the Bakken Shale in North Dakota, the Bezhenov Formation in Siberia, the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas. These are the kitchens where oil cooks, the geological ovens that transform death into energy. The quality of a source rock is measured by 2 factors: total organic carbon content and thermal maturity. A rock can be rich in organic matter, but if it has never been buried deep enough to reach the oil window, it will contain only kerogen, the waxy precursor to oil. Conversely, a rock can be thermally mature, but if it was deposited in an oxygen-rich environment where organic matter decayed before burial, it will generate little or no oil. Second, migration. Once oil forms, it does not stay in the source rock. It is lighter than the water, saturating the surrounding rock, less dense, and it wants to rise. It begins a slow, relentless upward journey, seeping through porous rock layers over millions of years. This migration is driven by pressure differentials, by the buoyancy of oil in water, by the capillary forces that pull fluids through tiny pore spaces. The migration pathways are critical. Oil moves through permeable rocks, sandstones with spaces between the grains, limestones riddled with fractures and dissolved cavities. If the rock is too tight, too impermeable, the oil becomes trapped in the source rock itself. These are called unconventional resources, like the oil shales being exploited today through hydraulic fracturing. Conventional oil, the easy oil, is oil that has migrated into more porous reservoir rocks. Third, it must encounter a reservoir rock. This acts like a 3-dimensional sponge, riddled with microscopic pores and fractures where oil can accumulate. The porosity, the percentage of the rock that is empty space, must be high enough to store significant quantities of oil, typically 10 to 30%. The permeability, how easily fluids can flow through the rock, must be high enough to allow oil to be extracted at commercial rates. A common misconception, perpetuated by Hollywood films and popular imagination, envisions oil pooling in vast underground caverns, black lakes hidden in the depths. This is fantasy. Oil saturates the tiny spaces within solid rock, much like water in a saturated kitchen sponge. When you drill into an oil reservoir, you're not tapping into a cave full of liquid. You're drilling into rock that is saturated with oil in its pore spaces. The oil must be pumped out, or in high-pressure reservoirs, it flows out driven by the pressure of water and gas deeper in the formation. The best reservoir rocks are sandstones and limestones. Sandstones have porosity created by spaces between sand grains. Limestones can have porosity created by the original structure of the rock, ancient coral reefs, for instance, or by dissolution, where slightly acidic water has carved channels and caverns through the rock over millions of years. Finally, and most crucially, there must be a cap rock or trap. This is an impermeable layer, salt, dense shale, tight limestone, that the oil cannot penetrate. Without a trap, oil continues its upward migration until it reaches the surface, where it seeps out, evaporates, or biodegrades into worthless tar. The trap holds the treasure. It is the geological prison that keeps oil underground long enough for humans to find it and drill it. These traps take elegant, beautiful geological forms that tell stories of tectonic violence and slow deformation. Anticlines, which are upward folds in rock layers resembling giant domes, created when horizontal compression forces bend sedimentary layers into arches. The crest of the arch becomes the highest point, and oil, being buoyant, migrates upward and pools there. The great oil fields of the Middle East, Ghawar in Saudi Arabia, Bergen in Kuwait, are anticline traps formed when the collision between Africa and Arabia crumpled the crust into perfect domes. Salt domes are another classic trap, common in the Gulf of Mexico and along the coasts of West Africa and Brazil. Salt, buried deep underground, is less dense than the rock around it, and is also plastic, meaning it flows over geological time. Under pressure, buried salt layers bulge upward, forming massive mushroom-shaped plugs that can be miles across and tens of thousands of feet tall. As the salt rises, it pushes aside the surrounding sedimentary layers, tilting them upward and creating traps along the flanks of the dome where oil can accumulate. Fault traps occur where a fracture in the crust brings permeable rock against an impermeable barrier, creating a seal. Stratigraphic traps are more subtle, created when a porous reservoir rock pinches out into impermeable shale, or when a sandstone lens is completely surrounded by shale. These are harder to find because they do not show up as dramatic structures on seismic surveys. The petroleum system also requires timing. The source rock must generate oil, the migration must occur, and the trap must already exist to catch the oil. If the trap forms after the oil is already migrated past, the system fails. If the trap is breached later by faulting or erosion, the oil escapes and is lost. The window of success is narrow, and the odds are stacked against accumulation. This is why finding oil is difficult, why most exploration wells are dry holes, why oil deposits are unevenly distributed across the planet. It is not enough to have ancient organic-rich sediments. You need the full sequence: deposition in an oxygen-poor environment, burial to the right depth, heating to the right temperature, migration through permeable pathways, and capture in a trap that remains sealed for millions of years. Each step must work, and they must work in the right order. This is also why the popular notion that oil comes from dinosaurs is fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. Dinosaurs lived on land. Oil forms from marine organisms. Most oil used today formed from plankton and algae that died long before the first Tyrannosaurus ever walked. By the time dinosaurs dominated the terrestrial world during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, much of today's oil was already cooked, sealed, and waiting in darkness thousands of feet underground. The dinosaurs walked above buried oceans they would never know existed, the geological jackpot, which raises the great geological question that has shaped geopolitics for over a century. Why the Middle East? Why does a single region surrounding the Persian Gulf hold nearly half of the planet's proven oil reserves? 48% of all known recoverable oil concentrated in a handful of countries you could cross by car in a few days. This was not luck. It was not divine favour. It was the consequence of a perfect geological storm that occurred once in Earth's history and will never repeat. 250 million years ago, during the Permian and Triassic periods, the geography of Earth was radically different. The continents were united in a single supercontinent called Pangaea. But between the northern landmass, Laurasia, and the southern landmass, Gondwana, a vast tropical ocean called Tethys stretched from what is now Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean, and the land that would become Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates sat on the southern passive margin of this ocean. It was a paradise for plankton, the microscopic photosynthetic organisms that would eventually become oil. The conditions were perfect, almost laboratory designed for oil formation. The climate was warm, much warmer than today, driving biological productivity to extraordinary levels. There were no ice caps. Sea levels were higher. The Tethys was a shallow epicontinental sea, meaning vast areas of continental crust were flooded to depths of only a few hundred feet. Shallow seas are critical for oil formation because sunlight penetrates to the bottom, allowing photosynthetic organisms to thrive throughout the water column. The biological productivity, the sheer tonnage of organic matter being created, was staggering. When these organisms died, they settled to the seafloor in a constant drizzle of organic snow. Most importantly, the bottom waters of the Tethys were often anoxic, devoid of oxygen. This occurred because the ocean was partially restricted, with limited connection to the open ocean. Water circulated slowly. Organic matter settling to the bottom consumed what little oxygen existed as it decayed. Once the oxygen was gone, decay stopped. The organic matter was preserved, accumulating in layers that would eventually become the source rocks. The Tethys also experienced repeated cycles of sea level change driven by climate oscillations and tectonic activity. When sea level fell, the shallow seas evaporated in the intense tropical heat, depositing thick layers of salt and gypsum, perfect cap rocks. When sea level rose again, the seas flooded back in, depositing new layers of organic-rich sediment. This happened over and over, creating a layered sequence of source rocks, reservoir rocks, and seal rocks stacked vertically like a geological parfait. The source rocks formed during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods are unbelievably rich in organic matter. The Hanifa Formation in Saudi Arabia, a Jurassic Age limestone, contains up to 10% organic carbon in some layers. The Sajelu Formation in Iraq, a Jurassic shale, is similarly rich. These rocks, buried and heated over millions of years, generated trillions of barrels of oil. Then came the final critical act in this geological drama. Beginning approximately 50 million years ago, during the Eocene epoch, the Arabian Plate, part of the African continent, began to collide with the Eurasian Plate. This collision was not a sudden crash, but a slow, grinding convergence occurring at a rate of a few centimeters per year. But over millions of years, the cumulative effect was catastrophic. The Tethys Ocean was squeezed shut, its floor buckled and thrust upward. That tectonic collision crumpled the sedimentary layers of the Tethys seafloor, like a rug being pushed against a wall. The crust folded into enormous wave-like structures hundreds of kilometers long. These folds became the Zagros Mountains in modern Iran, a range of parallel ridges and valleys that runs for over 1,500 kilometers. But the folding did not stop at the surface. Deep underground, the same compressive forces folded the oil-bearing rock layers into massive perfect anticlines, the geological domes that would trap the migrating oil. The timing was exquisite, almost miraculous. The oil had already been generated from the Jurassic and Cretaceous source rocks. It had begun migrating upward, driven by buoyancy and pressure. And just as it was moving through the rock, the collision created the anticline traps and sealed them with thick layers of evaporate, salt and anhydrite deposited during the earlier sea level fluctuations. The oil migrated into the crests of the anticlines and was caught there, unable to escape through the impermeable salt cap. The result was oil fields of unprecedented size. The Gawa field in Saudi Arabia, discovered in 1948, is the largest conventional oil field ever found. It originally contained between 75 and 83 billion barrels of recoverable oil, more than the total reserves of most countries. It is a single anticline, 220 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. The Bergen field in Kuwait, the second largest, originally held 72 billion barrels. These are not oil fields. They are geological anomalies, concentrations of energy so vast they defy comprehension. The Middle East's geological advantage is not limited to size. The reservoirs are also exceptionally high quality. The reservoir rocks are porous limestones and dolomites, often with porosities exceeding 20% and permeabilities so high that oil flows freely without needing extensive pumping or enhanced recovery techniques. The oil itself is often light and sweet, meaning it has low density and low sulfur content, making it easy and cheap to refine into gasoline and diesel. This combination of massive reserves, high-quality reservoirs, and easy extraction means that oil can be produced in the Middle East for a fraction of the cost anywhere else. In Saudi Arabia, the production cost can be as low as $3 to $5 per barrel. In the United States, shale oil cost $40 to $60 per barrel to produce. This cost advantage has shaped global politics for over a century and will continue to do so for decades to come. Daniel Yergin, the historian of petroleum whose book The Prize won the Pulitzer, called the Middle East the geological accident that shaped the modern world. Geologists have a more informal assessment. The Middle East has more oil than God intended for one region. It represents a concentration of energy so vast and singular that it was destined to warp human history, to create wealth beyond imagination, to fuel wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires. The Tethys Ocean is gone now, squeezed out of existence by the slow collision of continents, but its legacy remains, buried thousands of feet underground, waiting in the dark. Fire from the earth, long before humanity drilled into the earth, long before we understood what oil was or how it formed, the planet was advertising what lay beneath. Oil announced itself. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived alongside natural oil and gas seeps, places where geological pressure or fractures in the cap rock allowed hydrocarbons to migrate all the way to the surface. These seeps were not subtle. They were dramatic, often terrifying, phenomena that shaped mythology, religion, and the earlier stirrings of technology. In some places, these manifested as tar pits, thick accumulations of semi-solid bitumen, where lighter hydrocarbons had evaporated, leaving behind a sticky, viscous residue. The most famous are the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, which have been active for tens of thousands of years. Animals came to drink from water pooled on the surface, became trapped in the tar beneath, and died. Their bones accumulated in the tar, preserved in asphalt for millennia. Paleontologists have extracted millions of fossils from La Brea. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, all caught in a trap baited with water but flawed with petroleum. In Trinidad, an island in the Caribbean, there is a pitch lake covering 100 acres, the largest natural asphalt deposit in the world. It is not a lake in any normal sense. It is a slowly churning mass of semi-solid bitumen, warm to the touch, with a surface that undulates and flows over weeks and months. You can walk on it, though you sink slightly with each step. The lake is constantly replenished from below by seeping oil that rises to the surface, loses its volatile components to evaporation, and hardens into asphalt. The indigenous people of Trinidad used this asphalt for thousands of years to waterproof canoes and baskets, to seal the hulls of boats. Elsewhere, the seeps were far more dramatic, more supernatural in their appearance. On the Absheron Peninsula, in what is now Azerbaijan, the ground itself burned. Natural gas, seeping upward through fissures in the rock, ignited spontaneously, probably from lightning strikes or the sparks created by rockfalls. The result was eternal fires, flames that burned continuously for centuries, fed by invisible vapours rising from the earth, consuming no visible fuel. Standing before such a phenomenon in the ancient world must have seemed to confirm every supernatural belief, every intuition about the power sleeping beneath the earth. A fire that never dies. A fire that needs no wood, no oil, that simply exists, burning day and night, year after year, century after century. It is no wonder these sites became sacred, that temples were built around them, that pilgrims travelled for months across deserts and mountains to witness the miracle. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, venerates fire as the purest symbol of the divine. Zoroastrian fire temples were built around natural gas seeps in Persia and Azerbaijan, and the eternal flames were tended by priests who believed they were maintaining the light of Ahura Mazda, the supreme creator deity. The Ateshka of Baku, a temple complex on the Absheron Peninsula, was built around natural gas vents, and became a pilgrimage site for Zoroastrians and later for Hindus, who also venerate fire as sacred. The pilgrims did not know, could not have known, that they were standing on top of one of the largest oil and gas fields on the planet, that beneath their feet were layers of Jurassic and Cretaceous sediments saturated with hydrocarbons, that the eternal fire they worshipped was methane escaping from reservoirs miles below. They believed they were in the presence of the divine. In a sense, they were not wrong. They were standing at the intersection of geology and theology, at the place where the deep history of the planet breaks through into human consciousness, bitumen in Babylon. This surface oil, this bitumen, represented humanity's first encounter with petroleum, and we immediately instinctively found uses for it, integrating it into the earliest technologies of civilization. We used it as waterproof sealant. Bitumen is hydrophobic, meaning it repels water, and it remains pliable enough to seal gaps without cracking. Baskets woven from reeds were coated with bitumen to make them watertight for carrying water or storing grain. Boats were sealed with bitumen to keep water from seeping through gaps in the planks. The Bible mentions this in the story of Noah's Ark. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. That pitch was bitumen, collected from seeps in Mesopotamia. We used it as adhesive and mortar. Bitumen, when heated, becomes sticky and will bond to almost any surface. When it cools, it hardens into a strong, durable material. This made it ideal for binding stone tools, for hafting spear points to wooden shafts for fixing handles to pottery, and on a larger scale it became the mortar that held together the bricks of the first cities. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in ancient Mesopotamia, surface bitumen was abundant, seeping naturally from the ground near the town of Hit, about 160 kilometers west of modern Baghdad. This was the center of the ancient bitumen trade, and the substance harvested there was shipped throughout the region, becoming one of the most valuable commodities of the Bronze Age. The builders of the great Mesopotamian cities, Babylon, Uruk, used bitumen as mortar for their monumental architecture. Unlike mud mortar, which dissolves in rain and requires constant maintenance, bitumen mortar is waterproof and incredibly strong. The bricks bonded with bitumen create structures that can last thousands of years. King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon from 605 to 562 before the Common Era, was perhaps the greatest builder of the ancient world. He rebuilt Babylon into a city of wonders, using bitumen extensively to ensure the structural integrity and waterproofing of his constructions. The Etemenanke Ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the god Marduk, and often identified with the biblical Tower of Babel, was bound with bitumen mortar. The Ishtar Gate, covered in glazed blue bricks and decorated with relief sculptures of dragons and bulls, was set in bitumen. The famous Hanging Gardens, if they existed in Babylon and were not actually in Nineveh, as some scholars now believe, would have required extensive waterproofing with bitumen to prevent water from destroying the structure. The processional way of Babylon, the grand avenue leading to the Ishtar Gate, was paved with limestone slabs set in bitumen mortar, creating a road surface that could withstand the weight of heavy chariots and the passage of millions of feet over centuries. When archaeologists excavated Babylon in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found these bitumen-sealed pavements still intact after 2,500 years. But bitumen's uses extended far beyond construction. It was medicine, prescribed by physicians and sold by apothecaries as a cure for an astonishing array of ailments. Ancient cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, medical texts written in wedge-shaped script on clay, detail elaborate prescriptions using bitumen. One tablet describes a treatment for a blow to the cheek. Pound together fir turpentine, pine turpentine, tamarisk, daisy and flour. Mix in milk and beer in a small copper pan. Spread on skin. Bind on. The bitumen here acts as a binding agent and possibly as an antiseptic. though whether it actually helped or simply prevented infection through its waterproof properties is unclear. Bitumen was used topically to treat skin diseases, wounds, and arthritis. It was believed to have warming properties, to draw out poisons, to prevent decay. Some physicians prescribed it internally, mixed with wine or beer, to treat digestive ailments and coughs. This was almost certainly useless at best and poisonous at worst, as ingesting petroleum products can cause serious organ damage. But the practice persisted for thousands of years across multiple civilizations. Perhaps most strangely, bitumen became integral to humanity's attempts to cheat death. The ancient Egyptians developed the most sophisticated embalming techniques in the ancient world, transforming corpses into mummies that could last thousands of years. Central to this process was the use of natron, a naturally occurring salt to desiccate the body. But they also used imported bitumen in the later stages of mummification. The bitumen was melted and mixed with other substances to create a resin that was poured over the wrapped body, sealing it completely. This created a waterproof, airtight barrier that prevented moisture and microorganisms from causing decay. The Persian word for bitumen was mumia, and over centuries of mistranslation and linguistic evolution, this word became the English word mummy. The very name for preserved Egyptian corpses derives from the petroleum product used to preserve them. In the Middle Ages, European physicians believed that the bitumen from Egyptian mummies had special medical properties, enhanced by its association with death and preservation. They ground up pieces of mummies and sold the powder as medicine, a practice so widespread that it created a black market in mummy parts and led to the destruction of countless archaeological treasures. Apothecaries in London and Paris sold mummy powder well into the 18th century, long after most educated people realized it was nonsense. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel contains a revealing detail that most readers skip over, and they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. That slime was bitumen. The story, found in Genesis chapter 11, describes an attempt by humanity to build a tower reaching to heaven. God, seeing this as an act of hubris, confounds their language so they can no longer communicate and scatters them across the earth. Some interpretations suggest the story is making a point about technology and pride. Bitumen mortar was superior to ordinary mud mortar. It allowed for taller, stronger structures than had ever been built before. This technological advance gave humanity the confidence to attempt something previously impossible. The story becomes a warning about the dangers of technological hubris, about what happens when humans gain capabilities that exceed their wisdom. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the detail about bitumen mortar is historically accurate. The Tower of Babel is often identified with the Etemenanke ziggurat in Babylon, and we know from archaeology that it was indeed built with bitumen mortar. The biblical text preserves a memory of Mesopotamian construction techniques, a linguistic fossil embedding the knowledge that the great structures of Babylon were held together by the black substance drawn from the earth, the bamboo revolution. While the civilizations of the Middle East and Europe contented themselves scraping oil from the surface, on the other side of the world, in a region isolated from Western contact by mountains and distance, something truly revolutionary was occurring. The Chinese were drilling. In Sichuan province, in southwestern China, the most valuable commodity for over 2,000 years was not oil or gold or jade. It was salt. Human beings require salt to survive, but inland regions far from the ocean have no natural source. Salt was so valuable in ancient China that it was used as currency, that government monopolies on salt production could make or break dynasties, that salt smuggling was punishable by death. To obtain salt, the people of Sichuan had to extract it from underground brine, salt water trapped in geological formations thousands of feet below the surface. And to reach that brine, they had to drill. They developed percussion drilling, a technique that would not be matched in the West for nearly 2 millennia. The method was elegantly simple. A tall derrick constructed entirely from bamboo lashed together was erected over the drilling site. From the top of the derrick, a bamboo cable, made by splitting bamboo stems and weaving them into rope, was suspended. At the end of the cable hung a heavy iron drill bit, sharpened to a chisel point. The bit was repeatedly lifted and dropped, smashing into the rock below, pulverizing it bit by bit. Power for lifting the bit came from human labor, from teams of men jumping on leverboards that raised and lowered the cable in a rhythmic, hypnotic dance that could continue for days, weeks, months. As the hole deepened, more cable was let out. The crushed rock was removed using bamboo buckets. When groundwater flooded the hole, it was bailed out. When the bamboo cable wore out, it was replaced. The scale of this operation was staggering. By the 1830s, some wells in the Zigong area reached depths of 3,000 feet, nearly a kilometre down. They were, at that time, the deepest holes ever drilled by humankind, deeper than any mine shaft, deeper than any European well. And they were drilled with nothing but bamboo, iron, and human muscle. The drilling was slow, agonizingly slow by modern standards. A crew might advance only a few inches per day in hard rock. A deep well could take decades to complete, its construction spanning generations of drillers. Some wells became family heirlooms, passed from father to son, along with the knowledge of their precise location and depth. As they drilled for brine, the Chinese engineers repeatedly encountered something unexpected: natural gas. At first, this was a dangerous nuisance. When the drill bit penetrated a gas-bearing layer, the gas would rush up the borehole, sometimes igniting spontaneously and incinerating the derrick and everyone near it. Early drillers learned to recognize the signs of an impending gas strike: a distinctive smell, a sudden increase in the rate at which the bit sank, and would evacuate before the gas erupted. But the ingenious engineers of the Song dynasty, ruling from 960 to 1279, figured out how to harness this natural gas. They developed techniques to cap the wellhead and control the flow of gas. They constructed pipelines to transport it, using sections of bamboo with the internal nodes removed, bound together with hemp twine and sealed with a mixture of lime and tung oil. These pipelines could extend for kilometres, carrying gas from the wellhead to wherever it was needed. At the salt evaporation pans, the gas was burned to boil the brine, evaporating the water and leaving behind crystals of pure salt. This was a revolutionary development. Before the use of natural gas, salt production required burning enormous quantities of wood or coal to boil the brine. The process was expensive, labour-intensive and environmentally destructive, denuding entire hillsides of trees. Natural gas provided a cleaner, cheaper, nearly inexhaustible source of heat. By the 1850s, Zigong had become an industrial powerhouse, a city whose entire economy was based on the extraction and processing of subterranean resources. It produced 150,000 tons of salt annually, all powered by natural gas extracted through bamboo wells. The city was a forest of derricks, hundreds of them visible across the valley, their bamboo towers creaking in the wind. At night, the glow from thousands of gas flames illuminated the sky, turning the darkness orange. This was the first true industrial-scale use of hydrocarbons for fuel. It was a vision of the future, an entire economy running on energy drilled from deep within the earth, and it was accomplished using technology that was, by Western standards, impossibly primitive. No steel, no engines, just grass, iron, and an understanding of geology that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The bamboo drilling technique was not limited to Sichuan. It spread to other regions of China and eventually, through trade routes, to other parts of Asia. But it never reached Europe. When Western engineers finally began drilling for oil in the 1850s, they did so in complete ignorance of what the Chinese had been doing for 2,000 years. They had to reinvent the wheel, or in this case, the drill, this secret weapon. Meanwhile, back in the West, petroleum was about to become a weapon. In the 7th century of the Common Era, the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, was besieged and collapsing. The great city of Constantinople, built by Constantine on the site of ancient Byzantium, controlled the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. It was the wealthiest city in the Christian world, crammed with libraries, palaces, and churches filled with golden mosaics, and it was surrounded by enemies. The most dangerous were the armies of the new Islamic caliphates, who had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa with stunning speed. In 674, a massive Arab fleet sailed north to besiege Constantinople from the sea. The city's walls were impregnable to siege engines and infantry, but a fleet blockading the harbour could starve the city into submission. The Byzantines needed a weapon that could destroy ships at a distance, that could break the blockade before the city starved. And they unveiled something that terrified their enemies and changed naval warfare forever. They called it liquid fire. History knows it as Greek fire. Contemporary accounts describe it as a substance that was sprayed from bronze tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine dromons, the sleek war galleys that formed the backbone of the imperial navy. The substance ignited as it left the tube, creating a jet of flame that could engulf enemy ships, and it had properties that seemed almost supernatural. It burned on water. In fact, water seemed to make it burn more fiercely. Sailors who jumped overboard to escape burning ships found themselves igniting as they hit the water. The sea itself became a sheet of flame. Ships that tried to approach Byzantine vessels were incinerated before they could close the distance. The psychological effect was devastating. Even the bravest sailors broke formation and fled when they saw the bronze siphons being aimed at them. Greek fire was first deployed around 672 during the reign of Emperor Constantine IV. The Byzantines used it to devastating effect during the first Arab siege of Constantinople, which lasted from 674 to 678. The Arab fleet was annihilated, its ships reduced to charred wreckage. The siege was broken. Constantinople survived. When the Arabs tried again 40 years later, in 717, they came with an even larger fleet. The result was the same. Greek fire destroyed them. The Byzantine navy sailed out from the Golden Horn, siphons blazing, and turned the sea into an inferno. Bodies floated in the burning water. The survivors fled south, their fleet shattered. The weapon was delivered through pressurized bronze siphons, sophisticated devices that worked like giant syringes. Operators called siphonarioi pumped bellows to force the liquid fire through the tube. The siphons could be aimed, allowing Byzantine ships to direct the stream of fire with deadly accuracy. The range was limited, probably no more than 20 or 30 meters, but in close naval combat, that was enough. The composition of Greek fire remains one of history's great mysteries. The formula was a closely guarded state secret, known only to the emperors and a small circle of technicians who manufactured it. Revealing the formula was considered treason, a crime against God and empire punishable by death and eternal damnation. The secret was guarded so zealously that eventually it was lost. Modern historians and chemists have attempted to reconstruct the formula based on surviving descriptions and the known properties of the weapon. The consensus is that it was probably a mixture of petroleum-based substances, naphtha, a volatile fraction of crude oil, combined with other ingredients that gave it its unique properties. Sulfur was likely one component, lowering the ignition temperature and making the mixture easier to ignite. Quicklime, calcium oxide, was probably another critical ingredient. Quicklime reacts violently with water, generating intense heat. If Greek fire contained quicklime, then contact with water would cause it to ignite or burn more intensely, explaining why water could not extinguish it and seemed to make it worse. The heat from the quicklime reaction would ignite the petroleum, and the burning naphtha would float on water, spreading across the surface. Some reconstructions suggest the addition of saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which can act as an oxidizer, allowing the mixture to burn even when submerged. But saltpeter-based gunpowder was not invented until centuries later in China, and there is no definitive evidence that the Byzantines had access to it. The final ingredient may have been a thickening agent, possibly pine resin, that turned the liquid into a sticky gel similar to modern napalm. This would explain why Greek fire clung to ships and men, why it was so difficult to remove or extinguish. Once you were hit with it, you were essentially doomed. The Byzantines treated the formula not just as a military secret, but as a religious one. Legends claimed it was revealed to Constantine IV by an angel, a divine gift to protect Christendom from the Muslim invaders. Emperors swore oaths never to reveal it to foreigners. The technicians who manufactured it worked in secret, guarded facilities, and were forbidden to discuss their work. The formula was probably never written down in full, transmitted only orally from master to apprentice, which ensured security but also ensured eventual loss. Another legend suggests the formula was brought to Constantinople by Callinicos, a Greek architect and engineer from Heliopolis in modern Lebanon. Heliopolis was controlled by the Umayyad Caliphate at the time, and Callinicos supposedly defected, bringing knowledge of incendiary weapons with him. Whether he invented Greek fire or merely improved an existing Byzantine formula is debated. The formula was likely lost during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, one of the great tragedies of history. Western European crusaders, supposedly on their way to fight Muslims in Egypt, were diverted by Venetian merchants and political intrigue. They attacked and sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, slaughtering its inhabitants and looting its treasures. The imperial library was burned. Manuscripts that had survived for 1,000 years were destroyed. The artisans who knew how to make Greek fire were scattered or killed. By the time the Byzantine Empire was restored 57 years later, the knowledge was gone. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire forever, Greek fire was already a legend, a half-remembered miracle from a vanished age. The Byzantines no longer knew how to make it. The last emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting on the walls without the weapon that had saved his city 700 years before, the illumination crisis. For the next 1,000 years in Europe, petroleum receded into the background, a curiosity and a medicine rather than a strategic resource. It was known by its Latin name, oleum petrae, rock oil, a substance that oozed from the ground in certain places and was collected by peasants and sold to apothecaries. By the mid-19th century, the world was running out of light, or more precisely, the world was running out of affordable light. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Western societies, creating sprawling cities filled with factories that ran day and night. But when the sun set, those cities plunged into darkness. The wealthy burned whale oil in their lamps, specifically sperm whale oil, the finest illuminant known. It burned with a clear, bright, nearly smokeless flame. But decades of relentless hunting had driven whale populations toward collapse. Sperm whales, slow to reproduce and easy to track once spotted, were being slaughtered faster than they could replace themselves. Whaling ships sailed to the Arctic and Antarctic, to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, pursuing the remaining pods to the end of the earth. The price of sperm oil reflected this scarcity. By the 1840s, it cost $2.50 per gallon, a fortune for working-class families. A factory worker in New York might earn $1 a day. Lighting his home with whale oil would consume a significant portion of his income. Most people could not afford it and made do with tallow candles made from animal fat, which produced a dim, flickering, smoky flame and stank of burning meat, or with cheaper fish oils that smelled even worse. The cities needed light. The factories needed to run night shifts. The growing middle class wanted to read newspapers and books after sunset, to socialize, to extend the productive day beyond the natural limits imposed by the sun. There was enormous demand for a cheap, clean-burning illuminant. The market existed, hungry and waiting. What was missing was the product. The first breakthrough came not from petroleum drilled from the ground, but from petroleum extracted from rock through chemistry. In 1854, a Canadian geologist and entrepreneur named Abraham Gesner patented a process for distilling a liquid illuminant from coal and bituminous shale. The process involved heating the shale to high temperatures in an oxygen-free environment, cracking the complex organic molecules trapped in the rock and driving off vapors that could be condensed into a liquid fuel. Gessner called his product kerosene, from the Greek word keros, meaning wax, because the fuel had a slightly waxy appearance when cold. It burned with a bright, steady, smokeless flame. The colour was clear or slightly yellow, far more pleasant than the dark, smelly oils previously available, and most importantly, it cost less than $1 per gallon, a fraction of the price of whale oil. Gessner was not alone. Across the Atlantic in Scotland, a chemist named James Young had independently developed a similar process and opened the world's first commercial oil refinery in 1851. Young's refinery processed oil-bearing shale mined from a formation called Torbanite near Glasgow. The shale was crushed, heated in retorts, and distilled into 3 products: a light oil used as an illuminant, a heavier oil used for lubrication, and a solid residue called paraffin wax. Young's operation was small but profitable. By the mid-1850s there were imitators across Britain and Europe, all mining oil shale and cooking it to extract lamp oil. In the United States, Gessner licensed his kerosene process to refiners in New York and Pennsylvania. A new industry was being born based on extracting oil from rock. But there was a problem. Mining and processing oil shale was expensive and labour-intensive. You had to dig the shale out of the ground, transport it to a refinery, crush it, heat it to temperatures of 400 to 500 degrees Celsius, collect and condense the vapours, then dispose of mountains of spent shale. The process was inefficient, yielding only a few gallons of oil per ton of rock. The costs were high, limiting how cheap the final product could be. There was another potential source of oil: natural seeps, places where petroleum migrated to the surface and could be collected directly. But seeps produced only small quantities, a few barrels per year from each site. Scraping oil from the surface of creeks or digging shallow pits to collect seepage was slow, unpredictable work. It could not supply the massive quantities needed to meet growing demand. The industry had a product. It had a market. What it desperately needed was a cheap, reliable, abundant source of raw, crude oil. It needed a way to access the oil underground, to bypass the slow accumulation at seeps and tap directly into the reservoirs. It needed drilling. And the man who would prove that oil could be drilled, who would unlock the underground reserves and launch the petroleum age, was not a scientist or a geologist. He was an unemployed railroad conductor with no technical training and a fabricated military title: Drake's Gamble. His name was Edwin Laurentine Drake. In 1858, a group of investors in New Haven, Connecticut, who had formed a company called the Seneca Oil Company, hired Drake to travel to Titusville, a backwoods lumber town in northwestern Pennsylvania. There were oil seeps along a creek near Titusville. The investors wanted to know if it was possible to obtain more oil than what seeped naturally to the surface. Drake was not an obvious choice for this mission. He had been a conductor on the New York and New Haven Railroad, but had been forced to retire due to ill health and a painful back condition that left him with a permanent limp. He had no money, no technical expertise, no experience with oil. But he had one advantage that mattered to the investors. As a retired railroad employee, he had a lifetime pass allowing him to travel free on any railroad in the system. This would save the company money on his expenses. To give Drake an air of authority when he arrived in the rough frontier town of Titusville, the company's agent, James Townsend, began addressing letters to him as Colonel E. L. Drake. There was no basis for this title. Drake had never served in the military, but Townsend calculated correctly that a military title would impress the locals and make them more likely to take Drake seriously and offer assistance. Drake arrived in Titusville in December 1857. The town was a cluster of rough wooden buildings in a valley carved by Oil Creek, surrounded by dense forests. The creek got its name from the oil slicks visible on its surface, fed by natural seeps in the area. For decades, locals had collected this oil by damming small springs, allowing the oil to accumulate, then skimming it off the water. They sold it to patent medicine peddlers who bottled it as Seneca oil, marketing it as a cure for ailments ranging from rheumatism to deafness. Drake examined the seeps and came to a simple, radical conclusion. If salt drillers in the region could pound pipes into the ground to reach brine hundreds of feet underground, why could the same method not be used to reach oil? Oil and brine were often found together. Drilling for oil should work the same way as drilling for salt. Everyone thought he was insane. The local townspeople, hardened lumbermen, and salt drillers openly mocked him. They called him Crazy Drake and referred to his planned well as Drake's Folly. The idea of drilling specifically for oil seemed absurd. Oil was a byproduct of salt drilling, a nuisance that contaminated the brine. The notion that it could be valuable enough to justify drilling for it alone was laughable. Drake hired a local blacksmith and salt driller named William Smith, known to everyone as Uncle Billy, to do the actual drilling. Uncle Billy was skeptical but needed the work. They erected a wooden derrick and began pounding an iron drill pipe into the ground, using a steam engine to lift and drop a heavy iron bit. Almost immediately they ran into problems. The soil near the surface was loose and unconsolidated, a mix of clay, sand, and gravel left by glaciers. Every time they drilled a few feet down, the walls of the hole would collapse, filling the well with debris. They would spend days digging it out only to have it collapse again. The project ground to a halt. Drake solved the problem with an innovation that seems obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. He drove a wrought iron pipe down through the loose surface soil until it reached bedrock, creating a stable casing that prevented the hole from collapsing. Once the pipe was in place, they could drill through it into the solid rock below. This drive pipe technique became standard practice in the oil industry and is still used today. Through the spring and summer of 1859, they drilled slowly deeper. Progress was maddeningly slow, sometimes only a few feet per week. The drill bit had to be periodically pulled up and sharpened. The borehole had to be bailed out to remove crushed rock and groundwater, and all the while, money was running out. By August 1859, the project was bankrupt. The investors had lost faith. James Townsend sent a final money order with explicit instructions for Drake: pay your bills, close up the operation, and return to New Haven. The grand experiment was over. It had failed. But the mail was slow in 1859. Letters travelled by stagecoach and rail, and it could take a week or more for a letter to reach Titusville from Connecticut. Townsend's letter ordering Drake to shut down the operation was in transit when, on August 27th, at a depth of 69.5 feet, the drill bit suddenly dropped into a crevice. Uncle Billy pulled up the drill to sharpen the bit, as was customary at the end of a day's work, and left for the evening. The next day was Sunday. Uncle Billy returned to the well Sunday afternoon to check on it before the Monday drilling shift. He peered down the pipe and saw something unexpected. There was fluid inside, and it was not water. He fashioned a tin rain spout into a long dipper and lowered it down the pipe. He pulled it up. It was full of dark, greenish-black liquid. It was crude oil. Uncle Billy collected several bottles full and brought them to Drake. The next day, Drake set up a simple hand pump and began extracting oil from the well. It produced between 8 and 10 barrels per day initially, later increasing to 25 barrels per day. This does not sound impressive by modern standards, but it was a revelation. For the first time in human history, oil was being produced on demand, not gathered from seeps or squeezed from shale, but pumped directly from the earth. The well proved that vast supplies of oil existed underground and could be accessed through drilling. Within days, the news spread. Land prices in the Oil Creek Valley exploded. Men who owned worthless forest land became wealthy overnight. The population of Titusville began to swell as speculators, drillers, merchants, and labourers poured in. Drake himself received his termination letter from Townsend a few days after striking oil, a piece of ironic timing that must have given him some grim satisfaction. The letter became irrelevant. The well was producing. The investors, seeing that their gamble had paid off, reversed course and began pouring money into expanding operations. The modern oil industry had begun on that Sunday afternoon when Uncle Billy Smith peered into a pipe and saw the future. The Pennsylvania frenzy. What happened next was pure chaos. a frenzy of greed and speculation that transformed the landscape and created fortunes and disasters with equal abandon. News of Drake's success triggered a stampede. Within a year, 75 wells were operating in the Oil Creek Valley. Within 5 years, by 1865, Pennsylvania was producing 2.5 million barrels of oil annually. The forests that had covered the hills for thousands of years were clear-cut to make room for derricks. The valleys filled with wooden structures, storage tanks, and makeshift refineries. Boom towns erupted from wilderness with shocking speed. The most famous was Pithole, located about 15 miles south of Titusville. In January 1865, Pithole was farmland, a few scattered homesteads in a peaceful valley. In May 1865, oil was struck. By September, Pithole had become a city of 15,000 people, making it the third largest settlement in Pennsylvania after Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Pithole had 50 hotels, 2 telegraph offices, a daily newspaper called the Pithole Daily Record, theatres, saloons, brothels, and a chaotic, mud-clogged main street where the price of a lot could increase tenfold in a single day. It was the third busiest post office in Pennsylvania, processing more mail than Erie. Men arrived with nothing and became millionaires in weeks. Others arrived with their life savings and lost everything in days. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, Pithole vanished. The wells were shallow, tapping into small pools of oil trapped near the surface. Within 2 years, they began to run dry. Production collapsed. By 1868, people were leaving. By 1870, Pithole was a ghost town. Today, nothing remains but a historical marker and a few depressions in the ground where cellars once stood. This boom and bust cycle repeated across the oil regions as the area around Titusville became known. Towns appeared and disappeared like mayflies. The landscape became an industrial nightmare of derricks, storage tanks, oil-soaked soil, and polluted creeks. The early oil industry was lawless and violent, operating in a legal vacuum. There were no established property laws for subsurface minerals. If you owned the land, you owned whatever was under it. But oil does not respect property boundaries. It flows through porous rock, migrating from high-pressure areas to low-pressure areas. A well on your neighbour's property could drain the oil from the reservoir beneath your land, and there was nothing you could do about it. This led to the adoption of a legal principle called the rule of capture, borrowed from English common law regarding wild animals. The principle stated that whoever captures the resource owns it, regardless of where it came from. In practical terms, this meant whoever drilled a well and pumped out oil owned that oil, even if it had migrated from beneath someone else's property. The rule of capture created perverse incentives. If your neighbour was drilling, you had to drill too, as fast as possible, or risk having your oil stolen from beneath your feet. This led to a frantic, desperate race to drill as many wells as possible, as quickly as possible, with no regard for long-term reservoir management or conservation. Modern petroleum engineering has proven that oil reservoirs produce far more total oil if they are developed slowly and carefully, maintaining reservoir pressure and avoiding damage to the formation. But in the 1860s and 70s, no one knew this or cared. The imperative was to pump as much as possible as fast as possible before someone else got it. The result was catastrophic waste. Reservoirs that could have produced for decades were depleted in years. Wells drilled too close together interfered with each other, reducing overall recovery. Oil that could not be immediately sold or stored was simply dumped on the ground or into creeks. Storage was a constant problem. Oil was stored in wooden barrels, each holding 42 gallons. This barrel size, chosen somewhat arbitrarily by early Pennsylvania producers, became the standard unit of measurement for oil and remains so today. A modern oil futures contract is for 1,000 barrels. When someone says oil is trading at $80 per barrel, they mean per 42 gallons, the quantity that fit in a 19th century wooden barrel. But barrels were expensive and required skilled coopers to manufacture. During boom times, there were not enough barrels. Oil would accumulate in temporary earthen pits, exposed to evaporation and contamination. When production massively exceeded storage capacity, which happened repeatedly during the early years, producers simply dumped excess oil into Oil Creek. The creek itself became a symbol of the industry's waste and environmental destruction. At times it was covered from bank to bank with a thick slick of crude oil, a black mirror reflecting the derricks and smoke from the refineries. The oil slicks frequently caught fire, either from sparks or from deliberate arson by competitors. When Oil Creek burned, it was a vision of hell, a flaming river winding through the valley, black smoke rising into the sky, the heat intense enough to be felt hundreds of yards away. The flood of new oil onto the market caused prices to collapse. In 1860, crude oil sold for $10 per barrel at the wellhead. By 1861, overproduction had driven the price down to 10 cents per barrel. A barrel of crude oil was cheaper than a barrel of water. Producers who had taken out loans to finance drilling found themselves unable to cover their costs. Bankruptcies were common. Some drillers, ruined financially and seeing no way out, committed suicide. The boom and bust cycles, the waste, the ruinous competition, the oil industry was chaos incarnate. It desperately needed consolidation, organization, and control. It needed someone to impose order on the anarchy, and that someone was waiting in Cleveland, a bookkeeper with ice-cold eyes, and an unshakable belief that competition was not just inefficient but sinful. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, the Octopus. Rockefeller was not a wildcatter, not a driller, not a speculator betting on holes in the ground. He was a meticulous accountant who had made a comfortable living as a produce merchant during the Civil War, selling food to the Union Army. He saw the chaos of the oil regions and recognized that the real money, the real power, lay not in the risky business of drilling, but in the stable, controllable business of refining and transportation. In 1863, Rockefeller and a partner, Samuel Andrews, built a refinery in Cleveland. Cleveland was an ideal location, connected by railroad to the oil fields of Pennsylvania and by Great Lakes shipping to eastern markets. Andrews understood the chemistry of refining, while Rockefeller understood logistics, costs, and leverage. Rockefeller's genius was not technical. It was organizational and financial. He realized that the key to dominating the oil industry was not owning wells, but controlling the flow of oil from wellhead to consumer. If he could control the refineries and the transportation, he could squeeze out the producers and distributors and capture most of the profits. In 1870, Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. He and his partners began systematically buying out competitors, offering cash to struggling refiners who faced bankruptcy from the price fluctuations. Those who did not want to sell found themselves facing ruin. In 1871, Rockefeller and several other large refiners secretly formed the South Improvement Company, a cartel designed to control oil transportation. They made a deal with the major railroads. The railroads would charge much higher rates to ship oil for independent refiners, while giving massive secret rebates to South Improvement Company members. Even more audaciously, the railroads would pay the cartel members a drawback, a kickback, on the higher rates paid by their competitors. It was a conspiracy in the most literal sense, a secret agreement to destroy competition through manipulation of transportation costs. If you were not part of the cartel, you simply could not afford to ship your oil. You would be driven out of business. When word of the South Improvement Company leaked in 1872, the response was fury. Oil producers in Pennsylvania rioted, burning Rockefeller in effigy. They organized a boycott, refusing to sell oil to cartel refiners. The public outcry was so intense that the Pennsylvania legislature revoked the South Improvement Company's charter after only 3 months. But Rockefeller had already achieved his goal. Armed with the threat of railroad collusion, he had approached his competitors in Cleveland during the winter of 1872 and made them offers. Sell to me at a fair price, or face transportation costs that will bankrupt you. Most sold. In just 6 weeks, from February to April 1872, Rockefeller bought out 22 of his 26 Cleveland competitors. This period became known as the Cleveland Massacre. By the end of it, Rockefeller controlled 25% of the refining capacity in the United States. Standard Oil had become the dominant force in the industry, and Rockefeller was just getting started. Over the next 2 decades, Rockefeller expanded his empire through vertical integration and horizontal monopolization. Standard Oil bought oil pipelines, building a network that connected oil fields directly to refineries, bypassing the railroads and their high freight rates. The company bought tank cars and railway tank farms. It bought timberlands to make barrels and chemical companies to make sulfuric acid for refining. It bought ships and storage terminals in Europe. By 1880, Standard Oil refined 90% of the oil in the United States. By 1900, that figure was 95%. It was the first great industrial monopoly, an octopus whose tentacles reached into every aspect of the industry. No independent refiner could compete. Standard Oil's economies of scale, its control of transportation, its access to capital. These advantages were insurmountable. Rockefeller's methods were brutal and often legally questionable, though generally not technically illegal. He used industrial espionage, planting employees in competitors' firms to steal information about their costs, their customers, their vulnerabilities. He bribed railroad clerks to report on competitors' shipping volumes. He used predatory pricing, deliberately selling kerosene at a loss in specific markets to drive local competitors into bankruptcy, then raising prices once they were eliminated. He was ruthless in negotiations, using his leverage to extract favorable terms from suppliers and customers alike. There is a famous, probably apocryphal story of Rockefeller negotiating with a barrel manufacturer. The manufacturer quoted a price. Rockefeller asked if he could do better. The manufacturer lowered the price. Rockefeller remained silent, staring. The manufacturer, unnerved by the silence, lowered the price again. Rockefeller continued staring. The price dropped a 3rd time. Only then did Rockefeller agree. To the public, to the journalists who investigated his company, to the populists and progressives who railed against monopoly capitalism, Rockefeller was the embodiment of corporate evil. He was called robber baron, monopolist, the Napoleon of oil. Ida Tarbell, a journalist whose father had been ruined by Rockefeller's tactics, wrote a scathing exposé called The History of the Standard Oil Company, published in 1904, which helped turn public opinion decisively against the company and contributed to its eventual breakup. But Rockefeller saw himself very differently. He was a devout Baptist who attended church every Sunday, taught Sunday school, and gave generously to charity. He believed with total sincerity that he was doing God's work. He's often quoted as saying competition is a sin, and while the exact provenance of the quote is difficult to pin down, the sentiment perfectly captures his worldview. He saw the waste and chaos of the early oil industry, the boom and bust cycles, the ruinous price wars, the environmental destruction, and believed it was immoral. Resources were being squandered, capital was being destroyed, workers suffered when companies went bankrupt. To Rockefeller, consolidation and monopoly were not predatory practices, but rational solutions to irrational competition. He believed he was bringing order to chaos, stability to an industry that desperately needed it. The fact that this order enriched him beyond measure was, in his mind, a just reward for the service he was providing to society. He was not exploiting the market, he was perfecting it. This self-perception was not entirely delusional. Standard Oil did bring efficiencies to the refining industry. Its refineries were the most technologically advanced in the world. It invested heavily in research, developing new products and improving processes. It built a distribution network that brought kerosene to the most remote corners of America and the world, drastically lowering the price and making artificial light available to millions who could never have afforded whale oil. Between 1870 and 1900, the price of kerosene fell by 80% even as demand exploded. Part of this was due to increasing supply, but part was due to Standard Oil's efficiencies. Love him or hate him, Rockefeller transformed oil from an expensive curiosity into a cheap, ubiquitous commodity. He also gave away a staggering amount of money. Over his lifetime, Rockefeller donated over $500 million to philanthropic causes, the equivalent of tens of billions in today's dollars. He funded the University of Chicago, turning it into one of the great research universities in the world. He established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which pioneered treatments for diseases like yellow fever and meningitis. He funded campaigns that eradicated hookworm in the American South and fought malaria worldwide. The historical irony is profound. The man who crushed competitors without mercy, who built a monopoly through methods that would later be made illegal, also arguably saved more lives through his medical philanthropy than any businessman in history. He was both predator and benefactor, and the fortune that funded his charity came from the oil that powered the industrialization of the world, the Russian rival. While Rockefeller was conquering America, building his empire refinery by refinery, a parallel transformation was occurring on the other side of the world. In the Russian Empire, in the remote Caucasus region, the oil fields of Baku were about to explode into the global consciousness. Baku had been producing oil from hand-dug wells since the Middle Ages, but production was small and primitive. In 1872, Tsar Alexander II abolished the state monopoly on oil production and opened the Baku fields to private enterprise. The result was a rush that made Pennsylvania look tame by comparison. By 1900, Baku was producing half of the world's oil, more than the entire United States. The Absheron Peninsula was covered with derricks, a forest of wooden towers stretching to the horizon, wreathed in smoke and the stench of crude. It was an environmental apocalypse, a hellscape of oil-soaked earth and toxic fumes, but it was also one of the greatest industrial centers on Earth. The Rockefellers of Baku were a family, the Nobel brothers, Robert, Ludwig, and Alfred. Yes, that Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite and founder of the Nobel Prizes. The Nobel family had come to Russia from Sweden in the 1830s, and the brothers had built a fortune in engineering and armaments. In 1879, they established the Nobel Brothers Petroleum Production Company, known as Branobel, which would become the second largest oil company in the world, rivaled only by Standard Oil. The Nobels brought Western technology and organization to Baku, transforming a chaotic frontier industry into a modern, scientifically managed operation. They introduced innovations that changed the global oil industry. In 1878, Ludwig Nobel commissioned the construction of the Zoroaster, the world's first successful ocean-going oil tanker. Before this, oil was transported in wooden barrels, which leaked, were expensive, and required enormous labour to load and unload. A barrel-carrying ship might spend days in port just loading cargo. The Zoroaster was revolutionary. It had 8 separate tanks built into its hull, allowing it to carry bulk oil without barrels. It could be loaded and unloaded through pumps in a fraction of the time. It could carry far more oil than a barrel ship of equivalent size. The tanker made it economically feasible to transport oil across oceans, opening global markets. The Nobels also built the first long-distance oil pipelines in Russia, constructing a pipeline from the Baku fields to the port of Batum on the Black Sea, bypassing the expensive and unreliable overland transport by wagon and rail. Pipelines allowed oil to flow continuously from field to refinery to port, dramatically reducing costs and increasing efficiency. But the Baku region was harsh, almost uninhabitable. The climate was extreme, baking hot in summer and freezing in winter. The pollution was staggering. The oil fields were called the Black City because everything was covered in soot from the thousands of fires burning crude oil for heat and light. The air stank of sulfur and hydrogen sulfide. Disease was rampant. To attract and retain skilled workers, particularly the European engineers and technicians they needed to run their advanced operations, the Nobels built an oasis. They called it Villa Petrolia. Villa Petrolia was a planned community, a green paradise in the middle of the industrial wasteland. The Nobels imported millions of cubic feet of topsoil and thousands of tons of fresh water to create gardens, lawns, and tree-lined streets. They built comfortable homes with modern amenities, a rarity in Baku. They constructed a park with a bandstand, a theatre, a library, a bowling alley, even air conditioning in some buildings, achieved through ice brought from the mountains. It was a bubble of European refinement floating on a sea of crude, a desperate attempt to create livable conditions in an unlivable place. Workers who lived in Villa Petrolia enjoyed a standard of living far higher than what they could achieve in most European cities. They had access to culture, education, recreation, all provided by their employer in the middle of a toxic industrial zone. The Nobels saw this not as charity but as enlightened self-interest. Skilled labour was scarce. If they wanted to attract and keep the best people, they had to offer more than wages. Villa Petrolea was a recruitment and retention tool, and it worked. Branobel became known as a desirable employer, and engineers competed for positions there. The historical irony is again profound. The fortune that would fund the Nobel Prizes, the most prestigious awards in science, literature, and peace, was built partly on oil from Baku. Alfred Nobel's wealth came from two sources: dynamite, used to blast tunnels and oil wells, and petroleum, the fuel that would power the machines of war in the 20th century. The Nobel Peace Prize is funded by substances intimately connected to violence and destruction. By 1900, oil had become a global industry. Baku supplied half the world. Pennsylvania supplied much of the rest. Smaller fields were being developed in Indonesia, Romania, and Burma. Refineries operated in dozens of countries. Kerosene lamps lit homes from New York to Shanghai. Oil was no longer a curiosity or a medicine. It was a commodity, a necessity of modern life. But it was still just a fuel for lamps. The internal combustion engine existed but was rare and experimental. Transportation still relied on horses, steam trains, and sailing ships. The great transformation, the shift from oil as illuminant to oil as motive power, had not yet occurred. That transformation began on a small mound in Texas, on a winter morning in 1901, when the earth itself erupted. Spindletop. The place was called Spindletop, a salt dome rising gently from the flat coastal plain near Beaumont, Texas. The name supposedly came from a lone cone-shaped tree that stood atop the mound, visible for miles across the prairie, a landmark for travellers. There were gas seeps on Spindletop. Bubbles of methane rose through mud puddles. The ground smelled of sulphur. A local land speculator and self-taught geologist named Patillo Higgins was convinced there was oil beneath the dome. Professional geologists from the United States Geological Survey examined the site and declared there was no oil. The rock formations were wrong, they said. Higgins was wasting his time, but Higgins was stubborn. He had made a small fortune in lumber and real estate, and he was willing to risk it on his intuition. In 1899, he hired an Austrian mining engineer named Anthony Lucas, who had experience drilling for sulphur and salt in Louisiana. Lucas agreed that the geological signs suggested oil. Lucas hired the Hamel brothers, Al and Kurt, experienced drillers from Louisiana who specialized in rotary drilling, a newer technique that was faster than the cable tool drilling used in Pennsylvania. Rotary drilling uses a rotating bit attached to a hollow pipe, with mud pumped down the pipe to cool the bit and bring up the cuttings. It can drill through difficult formations like sand and clay that cause cable tool rigs to fail. The Hamels began drilling in October 1900. They used a drilling mud made from water mixed with clay, trampled by cattle to get the right consistency. This mud not only cooled the bit but also stabilized the walls of the hole, preventing collapse. It was a critical innovation that would become standard in oil drilling. They drilled through hundreds of feet of clay and sand, fighting lost circulation, cave-ins, and mechanical breakdowns. It was hard, frustrating work. They were burning through Lucas's money, and the deeper they went, the more it seemed the geologists might have been right. On the morning of January 10th, 1901, they had reached a depth of just over 1,000 feet. The drill was turning, biting through rock, when suddenly the bit hit a cavity and dropped several feet. The crew pulled the drill up to check the bit, as was standard practice. Then the well started to rumble. The ground vibrated. A geyser of mud erupted from the hole, shooting mud and 6 tons of drill pipe into the air like javelins. The pipe rose through the derrick, shattered the crown block, and fell back to earth in twisted fragments. The crew scattered, running for their lives. For several seconds there was silence. Then came a roar unlike anything anyone had ever heard, a deep, bone-shaking bellow from the earth, and then a column of crude oil, dark green and thick, shot out of the hole like a rocket, rising 150 feet into the air, a geyser of oil that dissolved into a mist that rained down for miles. The Lucas gusher blew at an estimated 100,000 barrels per day. In that moment, that single well was producing more oil than all the other wells in the United States combined. It produced more in a day than most Pennsylvania wells produced in a year. The scale was unprecedented, incomprehensible. For 9 days the well blew uncontrolled. Crews tried desperately to cap it, but the pressure was too great. Oil rained down on the surrounding area, turning the prairie black. The Hamill brothers and other drillers finally managed to install a valve and shut off the flow, but by then an estimated 800,000 to 1 million barrels had been wasted, more oil than Pennsylvania had produced in an entire year. Spindletop did not just produce oil, it produced it in quantities that shattered all previous concepts of supply and scale. Suddenly, the Pennsylvania fields looked small. The careful conservation and scientific management that people like Rockefeller had begun to implement seemed quaint. News of the gusher spread by telegraph. Within a year, more than 200 wells had been drilled on the Spindletop Dome. The hillside was so crowded with derricks that workers could walk from one to another without touching the ground, jumping from derrick floor to derrick floor like a ladder across the field. The flood of oil from Spindletop and other Texas fields discovered in the following years caused prices to collapse again, down to 3 cents per barrel by 1902. Oil was cheaper than water, cheaper than dirt. Storage became critical. Enormous earthen reservoirs were built, lakes of crude oil contained only by berms of dirt. When it rained, oil overflowed into the creeks and bays, creating environmental disasters, but also creating incentive to build better infrastructure. Spindletop marked a fundamental shift. It proved that oil could exist in quantities vast enough to power an industrial civilization. It proved that the limiting factor was not supply, but demand. There was more oil than the world knew what to do with, and the world was about to find uses for it. The age of fuel. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, a car cheap enough for the middle class. It ran on gasoline, the volatile byproduct of kerosene refining that had previously been considered waste, and was often dumped into rivers or burned off. Suddenly, gasoline was the most valuable fraction of crude oil. The automobile transformed everything. It changed how cities were built, where people lived, how goods were transported. It created suburbs, shopping centres, highways, drive-in theatres. It gave ordinary people mobility and freedom that had previously been the exclusive privilege of the wealthy. And it consumed petroleum in quantities that would have seemed insane 20 years earlier. Ford's genius was not just in designing a good car, it was in figuring out how to mass-produce it cheaply enough that his own workers could afford to buy one. By using assembly line techniques, standardized parts, and ruthless efficiency, Ford drove the price of a Model T down from $850 in 1908 to less than $300 by the 1920s. He sold 15 million of them. Each one needed gasoline, lots of it, and as cars proliferated, the demand for petroleum exploded. Refineries that had been optimized to produce kerosene for lamps had to be redesigned to maximize gasoline production. The entire industry pivoted from illumination to transportation, from lighting homes to moving people and goods. But cars were not the only new application for petroleum. The navies of the world were converting from coal to oil, a decision that would reshape global politics and help cause the First World War. Coal-fired ships required enormous crews to shovel coal into the boilers. The coal itself was heavy, dirty, and took up vast amounts of storage space. Refueling at sea was nearly impossible, and the smoke from coal fires could be seen for miles, advertising a ship's position to any enemy. Oil-fired ships solved all these problems. Oil contains more energy per unit weight than coal. It can be pumped into boilers automatically, reducing crew requirements. It can be refueled at sea through hoses, and it produces less visible smoke. Most importantly, oil-fired ships were faster. In naval warfare, speed is survival. The British Royal Navy, the largest in the world, made the decision to convert to oil in 1911, a decision championed by First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill. It was a strategic gamble of enormous magnitude. Britain had vast coal reserves. It had no oil. Converting to oil meant the Royal Navy would depend entirely on imported petroleum, primarily from Persia and the United States. Churchill understood the risk, but he also understood that Britain's naval supremacy, the foundation of its empire, depended on technological superiority. If Britain's rivals converted to oil and Britain did not, British ships would be slower, less efficient, outmatched. The decision to convert was not about preference. It was about survival. To secure oil supplies, the British government took a step unprecedented in peacetime. It bought a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which operated oil fields in what is now Iran. For the first time, a major government became directly involved in the oil business, owning production and refining assets abroad. Oil had become a strategic resource, as critical to national security as gunpowder or steel. When World War I erupted in 1914, petroleum played a role that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. It powered the ships of the British and German navies. It fueled the tanks that broke the stalemate of trench warfare. It powered the trucks that supplied armies in the field and the airplanes that fought for control of the skies. The war consumed oil at a rate that shocked even industry insiders. At one point, the Allies were burning more oil in a week than the entire world had produced in a year during the 1860s. Fuel shortages threatened to cripple military operations. The French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau sent a desperate telegram to the American President Woodrow Wilson. A failure in the supply of petrol would cause the immediate paralysis of our armies and might compel us to a peace unfavourable to the Allies. If the Allies do not wish to lose the war, then, at the moment of the Great German Offensive, they must not let France lack the petrol, which is as necessary as blood in the battles of tomorrow. The Allies won the war, and petroleum was one reason why. The Central Powers, particularly Germany, faced crippling fuel shortages. Germany had no significant domestic oil production and was cut off from foreign supplies by the Allied blockade. It tried to synthesize gasoline from coal, but the process was expensive and inefficient. Germany's tanks, trucks, and planes were often immobilized not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks. After the war, Clemenceau said that the Allies had floated to victory on a wave of oil. Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary, declared that the Allies had won the war on a flood of oil. Petroleum had proven itself as essential to modern warfare as ammunition. From the compressed death of ancient oceans, through the mortar of Babylon and the secret fire of Byzantium, through the bamboo wells of Sichuan and the folly of a fake colonel in Pennsylvania, through the ruthless monopoly of Rockefeller and the industrial hellscape of Baku, oil had completed its transformation. It was no longer a curiosity, a medicine, or a lamp fuel. It had become the central nervous system of modern industrial civilization, the substance without which the 20th century could not exist. The geological lottery had been drawn, and the winners were determined by events millions of years in the past. The corporate empires had been built, and the titans controlled the flow of this liquid treasure. The stage was set for a century of geopolitical struggle, for wars fought over access to oil, for the rise of petrostates and the fall of empires. The story of oil had become the story of the modern world. and that story would be written in blood as much as petroleum.